I'm gonna tell you all about what might be the most obscure dragon to ever exist in D&D. Everyone knows about the game's core cast of dragons. You got the 5 good ones, the 5 bad ones, and the 5 weird ones. But if you think that's it, then you've been lied to by Big Dragon. There are so many incredible draconic creatures in D&D's history that simply didn't make the cut into D&D 5th edition, and over the past 3 years, I've made it my personal mission to bring those dragons back into the fold by deep diving into their lore, ecology, and of course, updating their game stats. So far, we've covered all of the chromatic dragons, all but one of the metallic dragons, the entire family of ferrous dragons, and a couple oddities here and there. But there is one particular family of dragons who did eventually make it to 5e, but left some of their kin behind. The aforementioned weirdos. Gem dragons. Thanks to Fizban's Treasury of Dragons, we have Amethyst, Emerald, Sapphire, Topaz, and Crystal dragons. So in our growing draconic alignment wheel, where metallic dragons are generally good, chromatic dragons are evil, and ferrous dragons are lawful, the gem dragons are neutral on the axis of good and evil, with the only real differential between them being shades of law and chaos. But unlike the rest of their kin, Obsidian Dragons, while definitely part of the gem dragon family, are neutral evil. This might explain why they weren't included with the Gem Dragons when 5th edition D&D decided to put them in a book, but honestly, I think it goes a little deeper than that. The Obsidian Dragon is so far removed from the public eye, both in the worlds of D&D and in real life, very few people even know they exist, which is a real shame, because without a doubt, they are one of the most dangerous living creatures of all time. The first time an Obsidian Dragon was ever printed in D&D would be in Dragon Magazine issue 146, published in June of 1989. On the very end of page 23, then skipping over what looks like an ad for some very cool dice on page 24, and picking back up again on page 25, the Obsidian Dragon is shown in all its glory. But this isn't actually the creature we're here to talk about today. This Obsidian Dragon is essentially just a weird mutation of a silver dragon, specifically one native to the northern reaches of Greyhawk for 1st edition. But we still had gem dragons in 1st edition, kind of. They technically debuted for the game back in May of 1980 in issue 37 of Dragon Magazine, which back then was called The Dragon. Here, there is an article by Arthur W. Collins where he questions why there aren't any dragons with the neutral alignment, and also laments the fact that the core group of dragons are so well known by players, saying, "It's very frustrating to be graphically describing an unknown beast a party has encountered, only to have some encyclopedic fanatic quote you chapter and verse on what it is and what all of its abilities are." Which straight up is half the reason I started making videos about weird monsters in the first place, so I totally get it. He also went on to say, "There's just something fascinating about dragons, which leads us to explore new variations simply to enjoy the essence of dragonness." And enjoy the essence of dragonness we shall, because despite the fact that Arthur named this classification of dragons neutral dragons, he was the one who decided that Crystal, Topaz, Emerald, Sapphire, Amethyst, and Ruby dragons should be part of D&D, and he was the one who decided that they would be the neutral guys, and whether he knew it or not, this is where some of the most truly beloved creatures in the game got their start. So in 2nd edition, when these creatures were all reprinted in an actual monster manual nearly 9 years later, their lore would remain relatively unchanged from what was written in The Dragon, but they would get reclassified as gem dragons on account of the fact that they're all named after gems. You may also have noticed the mention of ruby dragons, which didn't appear as a bespoke stat block in 2nd edition, and have some kind of weird stats in 1st edition. This is because ruby dragons aren't really a type of dragon in this family, but rather, it is the head. There is one ruby dragon named Sardior, and he is the creator and god of all gem dragons, much like Tiamat is to chromatics, Bahamut is to metallics, and Groglathor kind of is for ferrous dragons. Now, are there more ruby dragons aside from Sardior? Maybe, but that's something I'm not gonna get into today. For this video, the only reason I'm telling you all of this is because it creates a bit of context around the next time gem dragons would be printed, and that is of course in 3rd edition. 3rd edition D&D would never just adapt something from an older edition. They just had to add to it. So they decided to add a new dragon to the family of gem dragons, and they did so in the weirdest imaginable way possible. The gem dragons all returned in 3rd edition's Monster Manual 2, which was published in September of 2002, but on January 24th, 2003, there were a couple articles put up on the Wizards of the Coast website. The first was simply titled The Legend of Sardior, which was all about the history and story of the patron deity of the gem dragons, the Ruby Dragon himself. They drew heavy inspiration from the original Neutral Dragons article from way back when, talking about how Sardior lives in a ruby castle that rotates around the world, always staying on the dark side opposite the sun, etc. Classic gem dragon lore. But they even kept up the story about how Sardior appointed a single Thane from each of the gem dragon species to be something of a representative for their people. Essentially, he was keeping a small council of ancient gem dragons close to operate as trusted advisors and so on. And this is where the first mention of Obsidian Dragons was ever brought to the surface. According to the legend, there was a 6th Thane named Cerades, an Obsidian Dragon of tremendous power and influence. Apparently, Sardior destroyed her and banished the Obsidian Dragons from his court forever, and nobody knows why. Even his own clergy and the other gem dragon Thanes don't know what happened. People who are experts on the matter will argue about whether they were banished for becoming evil or if they became evil as a result of this banishment, which is all pretty insane and paints Obsidian Dragons as something of a black sheep in the family. But since then, other gem dragons won't work with Obsidian Dragons, and when the two meet, it almost always results in conflict. But there were 2 articles published on that day, and the second article was titled simply Obsidian Dragon. And this was basically just a monster entry for this new type of dragon, which they had introduced in the first article. Since this was all on the old Wizards of the Coast website, which no longer exists, neither of these articles would be accessible if it weren't for web archive tools like the Wayback Machine, which is crazy. Once the site went down, these dragons were not only banished from Sardior's court, but also nearly from the game as a whole, which would have been such a shame because Obsidian Dragons are fucking awesome. They appear in a coat of smooth, glassy, black scales that are so fine they almost look like skin, aside from the creature's joints where the razor-sharp edges can be properly seen. Like all the other gem dragons, they are slightly less powerful when it comes to their physicality, but also like all the other gem dragons, they have psionic abilities. Mechanically, their psionic powers manifest in the same way that spells might, but they don't require any verbal material or somatic components, meaning that for a wizard or other magic user, it can be kind of hard to tell what the dragon is doing until it's too late. And this is where the Obsidian Dragon truly shines. While they may not be even the most physically capable among their own kind, taking second place to Amethyst Dragons, Obsidian Dragons are not only the most intelligent dragons ever created, they are among the most intelligent creatures in the multiverse. Obsidian Wormlings are vastly more intelligent than any humanoid creature, barring those who have extreme natural gifts or who have dedicated a lifetime to scholarly pursuits. Mechanically, they have an 18 intelligence when they are born, which is only 2 points away from the cap of 20 that is attainable for most playable characters. But by the time they are fully grown, this creature has an intelligence score of 30. There is nothing in the core monster manual with an intelligence score of 30. Liches have an int of 21. Solars, the highest in the core book, have an int of 25. The Demon Lord Fraz Urblu and the Archfiend Zerial are tied at a 26 for the highest int in a D&D 5e monster stat block put out in one of the mainline monster books. To my knowledge, the only creature with a 30 intelligence ever published in an official capacity is Mephistopheles, whose stat block appears in the Chains of Admodius adventure. If you don't know what that is, that's because Wizards of the Coast had basically zero marketing for it, but there exists a level 11 to 20 adventure that takes place in the 9 Hells, and it includes full stat blocks for every one of the Archfiends that rules over them, including Asmodeus himself. Anyways, The point I'm trying to make here is that Obsidian Dragons are in a unique class of their own when it comes to intelligence, one that is shared only with a singular fiendish entity known as one of, if not the smartest creatures who is not legally a god in the multiverse. And this is why Obsidian Dragons are far and away the most dangerous true dragon you could possibly have as an enemy. In a straight up fight, they might not be able to contend with the likes of a gold or red dragon, but they would also never be in a straight up fight with a gold or red dragon, or a group of adventurers they couldn't handle for that matter. It is so hard to even imagine what having a 30 intelligence might look like. That is some Watchmen-ass Dr. Manhattan levels of cosmic understanding, knowledge, and planning. The best way to deal with the threat of an Obsidian Dragon is to kill it before it has a chance to reach maximum potential. And if that's not an option, maybe consider, I don't know, time travel? The only real weakness they have, which coincidentally makes them even more terrifying, is the fact that they are extremely arrogant and violent. Obsidian Dragons know that they possess an intellect beyond even some of the most intelligent creatures in the multiverse, and they allow that fact to make them feel somewhat imperious, untouchable. See, they account for every possibility, every inevitability, and as such, they feel like they're always prepared. So you will likely never trick or deceive an Obsidian Dragon into making a mistake, but if you simply provide an opportunity for hubris, perhaps a Pyrrhic victory could present itself. But we haven't even talked about what these guys can do, which I am super stoked to get into because they have some really fun tricks both in and out of combat. But before we dive into that, if there's one thing reading all these old issues of Dragon Magazine has taught me, it's that us gamers are simple creatures, and since people started rolling them, we have loved some cool dice. And I'm stoked to give a shout out to this week's sponsor, Everything Dice. I have talked about my genuine love for Everything Dice on this channel before, and truly nothing has changed in that regard. Much like the Gem Dragons themselves, each one of these unique little math rocks are fantastically beautiful to look at, and since they're made of resin, they are lightweight, feel great to hold, and roll really nicely. This time around, they sent me the Andromeda Lux set, which are not only beautiful, but have this cool little planet inside of each dice, which are all made from the same material as the dice, meaning that any of their sets with neat little objects floating around in them will still be totally balanced for casual play like any good set of resin dice should be. They've also got these lovely leather dice holders for taking the goods to and from game night, and tons of different sets with at least one of them sure to match the vibe you're after. I own so many dice from these folks now. Some of them they've sent to me because I've done ads for them in the past. Some of them are just sets that I have bought or people have gifted me because I've asked for them as a gift. That is how much I like these dice. You can't really go wrong. So if you want to grab yourself some handmade resin dice from Everything Dice, use the link below or just punch in the code DungeonDad at checkout to get yourself 15% off. And if it's a gift for that special someone, they even come in a fancy little box with some sick art on it, so no wrapping required. So once again, thank you so much to Everything Dice for bringing us here this week to talk about Obsidian Dragons. Now, on to the part where we talk about why this creature is terror incarnate. Obsidian, despite what Minecraft would have you believe, is not exactly the toughest material. And unfortunately, that is where I get most of my information about rocks and rock-related objects. But thankfully, I happen to be friends with someone who is not only a geologist, but also a giant D&D nerd like me, and by chance of fate, we were both going to the same tabletop convention last week.
Obsidian is essentially volcanic glass, and it forms typically when lava, specifically felsic lava, which is like over 60% silica content, cools extremely fast so it doesn't have a chance to develop any crystalline structure. So this cools so quickly the crystals can't form. So it just kind of has this sort of amorphous design where it has this sort of sheen, glassy texture to it. Because of that, it's technically not classified as a mineral because minerals have crystalline structure to some degree.
Right.
And gems almost exclusively defined by that.
Okay.
So technically it's a mineraloid.
So it's not really a gem either then?
No, well, the problem is over time as a language evolves, right? Gem now refers to anything considered useful for its beauty in the terms of making jewelry.
Okay.
So like you would have an amber pendant and people would put that in a jewelry store.
Of course.
But really, it should just be called a jewel, not a gem.
So we should be calling them jewel dragons.
I would say jewel because mineraloid dragons doesn't sound very good, so
Yeah,
jewel
that's
dragons sounds better. But that would also encompass crystal, amethyst, all of those were all considered a jewel or could be considered a jewel.
Thank you, Ted. I appreciate your time and your incredibly spicy takes on gem dragons. I mean, it's literally glass formed as a byproduct of magma cooling rapidly, so it probably won't come as a surprise to learn that Obsidian Dragons have an affinity for extreme heat. They often make their lair in searing climates and especially love to nest in active volcanoes where they can just sort of vibe in a big pool of lava. The other place that these dragons like to hang out is on the plane of fire, because you can't really get much hotter than a world where everything is on, made of, or adjacent to fire. Aside from using their claws and jaws to rend people to shreds, along with all the other stuff dragons can normally do, the first unique thing about this creature is, of course, its breath weapon. The Obsidian Dragon breathes a cone of flames, which mechanically is more or less the same as the breath weapon of a red dragon. I thought this was fine, and it made logical sense, but I wanted to give them a little bit of spice to differentiate them from the bog standard fire breath, so I drew some inspiration from the dragon's psionic abilities. Something that 3rd edition D&D has, which 5e still lacks, is a robust system for psionics. There are a few psionic things in 5th edition, but we don't have anywhere near the amount of support for psionic shenanigans that we did back in the day. Depending on how you feel about psychic stuff happening in your fantasy RPG, that might be a good or bad thing, but regardless, this guy has a few psionic powers which were more or less just an alternate list of spells specific to psionic characters. And one of those powers is called Whitefire. Whitefire is a 3rd level power that creates an explosion of superheated flames, which at its baseline does 5d4 fire damage to any creatures in the area. It also sets everything on fire and melts metals with a lower than average melting point, such as gold. So as a little nod to this last psionic ability, my conversion of the Obsidian Dragon breathes a cone of white flames that burn so hot they ignore resistance to fire damage, but not straight up immunity. I also assigned the breath weapon to deal d4s in its damage, which is meant as a nod to the legacy psionic powers, but also does have mechanical implications. When you're rolling damage for an attack, the more dice you have, the more likely you are to roll the average damage number. This is the age-old debate between the greatsword and the great axe. Is it better to roll 1d12 with your axe or 2d6 with your sword? Mathematically, over time, you are statistically doing more damage with a greatsword by rolling 2 dice because you're giving yourself 2 different results, and a result of 1 is straight up not possible because you're always going to at least end up with 2 ones for a total of 2. A great axe, on the other hand, is much more likely than a great sword to roll maximum damage because you're only rolling 1 dice, so you only need to hit a 12 instead of hitting 2 6s. But you're also just as likely to roll a 1 and do minimum damage. Once you get into class abilities, feats, and weapon masteries, if you're using the new rules, this conversation gets a lot more complex, but the bottom line is rolling more dice of a smaller category generally increases the floor of your potential damage output and crunches the most likely damage outcome a lot closer to the middle. So a dragon that uses d4s for damage on its breath weapon is much less likely to roll insanely high, but it's also almost never going to whiff with a super low damage roll either. It's very consistent, just like the dragon themselves. As far as psionic powers, which in 5e are treated just like spells, from the Wormling stage, at will they have Firebolt, and once per day they have Flaming Sphere along with Tensor's Floating Disc. The only other major thing worth mentioning here is that they all have a trait called Perfect Recall, which allows them to accurately recall anything they have ever seen or heard, you know, on account of their brains being good. By the time this dragon graduates to the Ancient category, they also get access to spells like Identify, Magic Missile, Hold Monster, Scorching Ray, Wall of Force, and of course, the dragon's favorite spell, Plane Shift. Plane Shift is a spell all gem dragons have in their Ancient category, but the Obsidian Dragons have a special interest and mastery over moving between planes that allows them to learn it by the Adult category, and they can cast it twice when they're Ancient. This is of course because they like to spend so much time on the plane of fire and will often make themselves a lair there, but they still want to be able to move freely between the material plane and back. They've also developed a couple ways to use this spell as an offensive tool, which is very fun. By building up enough momentum and energy, then casting the spell mid-flight when going from the plane of fire to any other plane, the dragon is able to pull some of that elemental energy along with it, essentially casting Fireball on the location it chooses to appear in on the other plane. Not only is this an awesome entrance, it is also a great way to ambush ambush someone not expecting a dragon to suddenly appear in a giant explosion of flames. The other way they like to weaponize this spell also requires a little bit of explanation. As we all know, I'm sure, plane shift allows you and up to 8 willing creatures to teleport to another plane of existence, right? Well, this spell used to work in a slightly different way. For all intents and purposes, it did the same thing, but it was missing a single word, that word being willing. In 3rd edition, you can send a single unwilling creature to another plane if they fail the saving throw against your spell save DC. And you better believe that's the kind of thing an Obsidian Dragon just loves to do. They would just send a target to the plane of fire and let them burn to death, which is so brutal, but also makes total sense, especially for a creature who has mastered the art of moving between planes. Now, I do totally get from a gameplay perspective that might not be the most fun thing to deal with, because even if you can survive on the plane of fire, you're still just kind of stuck there unless you can plane shift yourself back. So my solution was to simply give the dragon a once per day ability I call Planar Jaunt, where as a bonus action after it hits a creature with a melee attack, much like casting a smite, it can grab that creature and plane shift itself along with the creature it is now grappling to the plane of fire, where they just spend a full round hurtling through the flames before returning back to a spot within 60 feet of where they left from. This obviously does a shit ton of fire damage, and if you beef it on the save by 5 or more, you also gain a level of exhaustion. This is still extremely brutal, but hey, you're fighting an Obsidian Dragon, you should be prepared, because it certainly will be. The final spell I want to talk about in this creature's list is exclusive to the Ancient Age category, and that spell is Demiplane. When an Obsidian Dragon casts Demiplane, it can create an area up to 6 miles in diameter with a door big enough for a gargantuan dragon, of course. And it could use this spell for all sorts of things. Being able to manifest your own little pocket world is a really useful tool, it turns out. Many of them simply use it to establish their lair in a place where they have absolute control over just about everything. But the real question, of course, is how would you even run an adventure with this creature? I'm so glad you asked. First and foremost, let's talk about Sardior for a quick sec. Why did he banish our sweet Obsidian boys? This single fact has so much potential to be a really cool piece of world building, and honestly, it makes me kind of sad that they didn't choose to include any mention of this in the Gem Dragon update they did in Fizban's Treasury of Dragons for 5e. Now, obviously a big part of this story is that nobody truly knows what happened and why the Obsidian Dragons were banished in the first place. I feel like if it was because they were doing evil stuff, the other Gem Dragon Thanes would have at least had an inkling to what was going on, right? Like, the Obsidian Dragon Thane, Cerades, if she had been pushing boundaries or getting up to some kind of sketchy stuff when she was slain and the other dragons banished, it stands to reason that all the dragon rulers would have been like, ah yeah, I guess she finally did something that was a step too far. But no, they're all just kind of confused about it, and good old Sardior won't explain why, which I mean, you'd think he would just say, oh yeah, I caught her selling drugs to teens under an overpass or something. I can't help but feel like the reason he's being so cagey about the Obsidian Dragons is because they didn't actually do anything to deserve their fate, at least not yet. This is pure conjecture on my end, but I can't help but think that maybe, just maybe, Sardior realized how incredibly capable the Obsidian Dragons were and saw it as a threat. Just think about it. He's hanging out in his flying castle with all the Thanes, things are good, but over time he watches Cerades grow and become this impossibly intelligent creature, a being with unmatched potential among her peers as an intellectual, and maybe a creature who could even outclass some of the lesser gods with her intelligence. Maybe even she finds herself smarter than Sardior. So all of a sudden, he gets a little uncomfortable. Maybe his power is not as absolute as he thought it was. Maybe the Obsidian Dragon Thane has been scheming against him this whole time. Before he knows it, she'll be the one sitting on the throne, at least that's what he fears might happen. So, in order to solve the problem before it becomes one, he slays her and banishes her ilk, hoping to see the Obsidian Dragon species die out, or at least lose any foothold they might have on their path to potential godhood. One particular scrap of lore at the bottom of the page attached to an asterisk says, "It's still within Sardior's power to bring back Cerades, if he chooses to do so." Why is that true? Was she not truly destroyed and instead her essence captured or imprisoned? I mean, maybe he's just that powerful. It's not truly possible to know the answer to any of this, and that of course means it's up to you to decide what may or may not be true. if you want to engage with any of this stuff at all. But I do think this all has major potential for an epic level campaign where the party is digging to find out what happened to the Obsidian Dragon Thane and why Sardior banished them to begin with. Maybe it's as I said, and the party decides to restore the wrongfully slain dragon in order to bring the Obsidian Dragons back into the fold, possibly even changing their path from evil. Or maybe Sardior did it for a good reason and his silence was merely to protect the world from whatever dark forces Sarades was engaging with. Either way, that could be really interesting. Obsidian Dragons also make for incredible villains at literally any age category. This is a creature with Machiavellian potential, acting as a puppet master, an incredible schemer, unfolding plans within plans within plans, which is always a great archetype of a villain to run. Maybe one of these dragons has taken over a powerful Afridi lord's domain on the plane of fire, and now this Afridi is beseeching the party for help, promising them wishes and treasures if they can aid in dealing with whatever this dragon is up to. I also think this creature is a prime candidate for a Dreadlord. If you don't know what that is, the most famous example is definitely Count Strahd, but more or less it's a creature who is imprisoned by the dark powers in a domain meant to serve as a grim reflection of the individual. I can imagine an isolated demiplane just filled with mountains of obsidian glass serving as the home of some punished obsidian dragon who did something even the dark powers were not fond of. It's also entirely possible the Obsidian Dragons just have a bad rap and your party encounters one expecting to be burned alive only to realize that the stories of their villainy have been greatly exaggerated, which then loops back into the idea that they were banished under false pretense. I will say, the one thing that isn't really fleshed out about these creatures is that we don't have a whole lot of information on what kind of objects constitute their hoard, other than the fact that they obviously wouldn't hoard things which can't survive in their lair. Magic books are all good and fine until you take them back to your volcano and they catch on fire. But as AJ Pickett pointed out in his video about Obsidian Dragons, which I highly suggest you go check out after this, if you can memorize anything you read, you don't need the book once you've seen everything within it. As for wealth, obviously precious gems take the top tier spot, but I also like the idea that their giant pile of gold is actually just a big old pot of molten gold pieces and they bathe in it on account of the extreme temperatures that have melted it down. But if nothing else, an Obsidian Dragon could always serve as a potential way to access another plane or an incredible bit of information if the story calls for it, and the party's willing to pay whatever price the dragon sets forth. But however you choose to use this monster, as always, linked in the description down below is my 5th edition conversion of this creature in the form of a Google document. And if you are one of my lovely patrons over on the Dungeon Dad Patreon page, you will find the high-res PDF version of this monster, which does contain all the same information, but it's just in a nicer, fancier format as my way of saying thank you to those of you who choose to throw a couple extra bucks my way and help me keep on doing what I'm doing here. Speaking of which, it's time for Patron of the Week. And this week's randomly selected patron is Lost Hero 360. Thank you so much to Lost Hero 360. I hope you find your way back home. But thanks for the support that you're offering in the meantime. And thank you for watching. As always, if there's a monster you would like to see on Monster of the Week, let me know in the comments down below or in the Dungeon Dad Discord and the Monster Suggestions channel. And who knows, you might just see it show up in a future episode of Monster of the Week. The other thing you can find down there is going to be a link to the Dungeon Dad official merch shop. There's a couple things up there right now up for pre-order in terms of apparel, and I'm also going to be putting up the PDF and physical copy of an adventure zine that I put together. It's just a little 16 pager. I guess it's 18 pages, but like the inside cover, back inside cover, if we're counting the covers in the back, it's 20 pages. It's a little adventure zine about an archfey and how he is coming back to collect the price of a terrible Fey deal made in his name after 333 years. So if you want to check that out, you can do so there as well. It's up for pre-order. Get yourself a physical copy. It's going to be pretty cool. I had a lot of fun making it. I had to learn so many new skills because I did all of the layout and design and everything. So that was kind of fun. And since I know how to do that stuff now, maybe I'll make more in the future if you guys like this one. Also, if you are one of my patrons, be sure to check over on the Patreon when that adventure comes out, because I will be offering the PDF version for free to all of my $5 patrons and above. If you want a physical copy, you gotta go to the store. Anyways, once again, thank you so much for watching. That's all I got this week. I'll see you in the next one. Until then.